Okay, so welcome to part two of this Civil War homework assignment. So when we last left off, people were waiting for Lincoln, and Lincoln gives his first inaugural address. Now, as I said earlier, everybody knows Lincoln's great. Everyone knows he's one of our greatest presidents. But I feel like a lot of people don't really understand some of the things that made Lincoln amazing. And this is one of them. So when Lincoln gives his inaugural address, I always like to explain it like this. In many ways, he's speaking to three very, very important different interest groups. One are the Southerners. He's talking to the South, and it's a plea for peace. He's telling them that he doesn't want this. He does not want there to be a fight. He wants to keep the Union together. The second group that he's talking to are members of Congress. And what he's telling members of Congress essentially is that he is going to handle this, that they're not going to handle this, that he is going to handle this. And the third interest group that he's talking to are foreign countries, most notably England. And he's essentially telling them, stay out of this. This is our issue. This is our fight, so to speak. Don't get involved. So, with that in mind, let me kind of walk through his inaugural address with you briefly and explain exactly what I mean by that. So, the question was, and what had happened prior to Lincoln becoming president, were that there were all these federal forts in the South, and the South was taking them over as they engaged in secession. And Lincoln strongly states that no further forts will be handed over to the South. Now, as most of you know, this is going to lead to a conflict at Fort Sumter and is widely regarded as the start of the Civil War. So Lincoln starts by saying, this will end. Now, this seems obvious now, but at the time, some people thought that maybe Lincoln would just allow the South to secede. Now, this second bullet point is a little bit confusing, so I want to explain it in the context of Lincoln being a lawyer. So Lincoln's a lawyer, and as a lawyer, he's going to follow a legal course, and he's going to argue his point in a legal manner. So, who has the power to deal with Southern secession? If the South had seceded, which, by the way, they clearly did, they seceded, they had their own president, they had their own government. But if the South seceded and was seen as a separate country, in that instance, then Congress would have the power to handle the issue with the South because they're a separate country. So Congress has the power to declare war. You can only declare war on a separate country. So it would be a congressional issue. So what Lincoln does is Lincoln stands up and he says something that actually doesn't really make a lot of sense, but I want to explain why Lincoln phrased it like this. Lincoln essentially says secession is illegal. Therefore, it hasn't occurred. Now, this is, like saying someone breaks up with you, you're dating someone and they break up with you, and you saying, oh no, you're not allowed to break up with me. Lincoln is essentially saying, you're not allowed to leave the Union. Famously, he said, it's a union of people, not a union of states. And since you're not allowed to secede, you haven't. Now, when we listen to this now, we say, well, that doesn't make any sense. Of course they seceded. They have their own president. They have their own laws. They have their own country. Lincoln is arguing that as a lawyer because if the South was seen as a separate country, then it would have been Congress's power to deal with them. Lincoln essentially, in making this strange argument, is telling Congress, I have the power to deal with this. This is not a separate country. This is a rebellion. And presidents have the power to deal with rebellion. So Lincoln is being incredibly savvy here and incredibly strong in his statement. Essentially, he's pointing one finger at the South and telling them they're not allowed to secede, and they better not, and they better come back into this union or else he's going to deal with it. And then he turns to Congress and essentially is pointing his finger at them and telling them, I'm the one that's going to handle this, not you. which was incredibly strong, especially for this time period when essentially America had been used to fairly weak, ineffective presidents. Um, in retrospect, this was brilliant because the politics of the time or of any time would have made it incredibly difficult for Congress to handle this issue, especially when the war got hard. The political pressure on Congress to end the war, to negotiate an end. Lincoln is so strong here. And he's pointing a finger across the Atlantic Ocean, telling them to stay out of it. So it's this initial first moments of his presidency where everyone is taken aback because no one expects this out of Lincoln. As I said earlier, there were low expectations for Lincoln, and Lincoln stands up, and I'm just going to repeat it one more time. And he points a finger at the South and he says, "You're not allowed to secede. You better not, or else." He points a finger at the Congress and saying, don't you think you're handling this? I'm handling this. And he points a finger across the Atlantic and tells foreign countries, and you guys better stay out of this as well. Lincoln distinguished himself right from the very start. Now, when we look at Lincoln's objectives, there's a lot of things that go on during the Civil War, needless to say. And one way to kind of frame it, I always tell my students, is to think about Lincoln's objectives. Lincoln essentially had three objectives: keep the border states in the Union. I might have the quote in this presentation somewhere. I forgot if I put it in, but one of my favorite quotes, Lincoln says, "I hope God is with us, but I need Kentucky." I hope God is with us, but I need Kentucky. The border states must stay in the Union. And if you look at everything that Lincoln does through that lens, through that objective, you start to look at things like the Emancipation Proclamation differently than you did before. Was the Emancipation Proclamation an attempt to end slavery? To a degree, but when he issued it, he did not free the slaves in the border states. Well, why would he issue the Emancipation Proclamation and not free slaves where he actually had the power to free them in the border states, but issue an end of slavery in a territory that he currently had no control over, the South? So when you look at Lincoln's actions through that lens, it kind of changes how we view them. Like I said, most famously, probably the Emancipation Proclamation. Keeping England out of war. There were as many copies of the Emancipation Proclamation sent to European countries as there were sent around the United States. So was the Emancipation Proclamation an attempt to end slavery, or was it an attempt to change the focus of the war in terms of foreign policy? Because England and other countries were opposed to slavery. So if this war was no longer about union, in other words, keeping the country together, but was about slavery, it was more likely that England would have stayed out of it. So, and of course, the debate, a hotly debated topic, which is surprising to many. Some people debate just how passionate Lincoln was about ending slavery. Was that truly his major goal in fighting the Civil War? And we're going to talk about that quite a bit in class. I'm going to introduce it to you here. So as we move forward here, let's see. As we move forward in this presentation, let me just do that. There's that famous quote that I said to you before. I thought I put it in this presentation. I hope God is with us, but we need Kentucky. And let's look at Lincoln's confusing position on slavery and race. In 1858, Lincoln, and during that famous Lincoln-Douglas debate that I had mentioned earlier, Lincoln famously said, "A house cannot stand divided against itself. It cannot long endure half free and half slave." This is, of course, one of the most famous speeches that Lincoln gives. And many people would say, well, this is proof that Lincoln wanted to end slavery. The Crittenden Compromise, which essentially guaranteed slavery forever, Lincoln refused it. If Lincoln really wanted to end, if his main objective was to keep the country together, he could have done that by sacrificing the proposition that slavery would one day be ended. But Lincoln doesn't. He refuses the Crittenden Compromise. And then this is one of the most important quotes. You see this quote all the time. People like to pull this quote out when Lincoln famously said, if I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. If I could free it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. A lot of people like to point to this quote and like to say, look, Lincoln wasn't really that interested in freeing slavery. It was about union. So Lincoln has these confusing positions on slavery. And how can we explain this? Was Lincoln confused? Did Lincoln change his opinion on slavery as time went on? Certainly that would be understandable, people changing their positions. And I almost don't want to tell you what to think here. I really, really don't, actually. I want you to look at the evidence and decide for yourself. But I want to point out some things that might help you clarify that opinion for yourself. Some people also like to point out that Lincoln was a politician. And we don't like to think of Lincoln as a politician because a lot of people don't like politicians. They say something to get elected, or they do something to curry favor with one interest group because they know it's going to play well. And we don't like that. We like to think of Lincoln as idealistic and beyond or above politics, but Lincoln wasn't. Lincoln was actually an incredibly savvy, adroit, smart politician, and he understood that when he was speaking in front of one group of people, that he needed to come out more strongly against slavery, and when he was speaking to another group of people, he needed to temper those remarks. But I think Lincoln's actions speak strongly. His refusal of the Crittenden Compromise, his fight for the 13th Amendment. It's interesting to note that the Emancipation Proclamation does not free slaves in the territory where Lincoln could have. So there's this little sing-songy thing that sometimes people say, I hope I don't mess it up here, where Lincoln could have freed the slaves, he didn't. And where Lincoln couldn't free the slaves, he did. So the Emancipation Proclamation applied to slaves living in the South. Well, Lincoln wasn't in control of the South at this point. What area of the country did Lincoln control that had slaves? The border states. And the border states did not have to abide by the Emancipation Proclamation. It allowed them to keep their slaves. So this idea, and later as we move forward with the activity, you're going to think about this. I would encourage you to maybe open up a separate tab and do a little independent research on this. But this idea of why did Lincoln fight the Civil War? What was Lincoln's main intent? And what's really interesting to me isn't really just that question. What's really interesting to me is, why does that question matter so much to people today? Why are there people today who like to say, no, Lincoln wasn't interested in freeing the slaves as much as people think he was. He was interested in saving the Union. And read this quote. This quote's proof of it. And, if you take this quote in and of itself, you might say that it's proof that Lincoln felt that way. But of course, Lincoln also has a lot of actions. And some would say actions speak louder than words. So moving forward, Lincoln gives this strong statement. The South moves on Fort Sumter. And of course, the big debate is, who started this war? Was it Lincoln refusing to give Fort Sumter up? Was it the South's demand that Fort Sumter surrender? A debate that rages on even to this day. But after Fort Sumter, as I said before, these northern states, most notably Virginia, where many of the great Civil War leaders are going to come out of. Additionally, it had the largest industry of any of the other southern states. After Fort Sumter, the Confederacy becomes complete. All right. So once again, I'm going to stop here. There's going to be a few things for you to do in the nearpod. And then we're going to pick up in just a second. I'm going to pick up in just a second. You're probably going to do some of that work for a little bit. And then we'll continue on.